Today I'll be talking about how do we create diverse communities. And I'm talking about that because it's a question I constantly get. I'm asked to talk about diversity in all kinds of spaces, in the classroom, in workshops for community organizations, here, outside of the country. And people always want to know what this means. How do we go about doing this? And there's no easy answers, right? So I'm going to give you some tips today that I hope will help you the way that they've helped me. Not a magic pill, but hopefully something to help us start some conversations. Now, first of all, I want to say that when I hear the word diversity, I get a little scared sometimes and a little suspect. And I think some of you do as well. And the reason for that is because for many people, when we say diversity, we're talking about a celebration of difference. The fact that we have different languages, different cultures, that we dance salsa and hip hop these days, that we are sexually diverse communities, right? That we have communities with different degrees of ability, disability, and that we come to celebrate that joyfully in different spaces. And that's fine. We need to celebrate that. That's beautiful. It brings beauty to the world. But I want to suggest here and propose to you that that is not enough. That if we really want to create diverse communities, we have to create equal communities, just communities, where everybody's perspectives are heard the same way, where we acknowledge that for some of us, our difference has not always been celebrated, but actually been marginalized, excluded, and it has meant that for some people, and in particular today, I'll be talking about racial difference and racism, and what it has meant for indigenous peoples and people of color to have had less access to jobs, to education, to healthcare, to this day, that we actually are struggling with these issues today, that it really matters. So if I want to celebrate diversity, I cannot ignore those questions of social inequality. Which takes me then to these two questions that people always ask me. How can I address social inequalities? And how can I transform my community, right? And these are questions I constantly get, especially from young people. And I see a lot of young people in the audience, so I hope this will be useful to you. Now, what I propose today to answer these questions are the 7 principles. And I kind of call them the 7 principles of the 7 C's, or the principles that I hope will bring people from the 7 C's together on the table to have these conversations. And the first 2 are really important and crucial. They're for me requirements for any kind of discussion of diversity and inequality. Listening and respect. And when I talk about listening, I'm not just talking about listening with my ear. No, I'm talking about paying attention to other people. Really paying attention to the world around you. Not just being secluded in my little bubble of what I experience of the world, but really learning about how other people experience the world. Reading, watching films, talking to different kinds of people. And respecting what I get from those interactions, right? Really respecting it, not getting defensive or starting to question it. Sit with it. Sometimes we have to be quiet, and that's okay. Quiet and absorb what we're receiving. Then reflecting and transforming ourselves are the following principles that I think are really crucial here. Because then I have to really think about, wait, how does this change my perception of the world and of myself in that world, right? So for example, if I'm somebody who identifies as white, and I've lived always in Eugene, Oregon, and I tell people when they come here, this place is so friendly, anything goes in Eugene, that's what I always hear. And it kind of is true. Anything goes here, it's such a free place. But then you hear a person of color and the story that, we could tell you, that's that sometimes walking downtown Eugene is not that safe for us, right? That sometimes walking downtown Eugene means bracing yourself for maybe a racial insult or a real attack on somebody screaming at you, you don't belong in this place because of your racial background, right? Those are things that happen in this town. What happens then if you take that experience and absorb it into your body, right? Even though if you don't feel it in your body, you can at least absorb it in your body, in your mind, in your heart. And how does that transform your perception of this place? Open yourself to that. That's my invitation. And lastly, the last 3 principles are really important. Keeping ourselves accountable and creating from that place. For me, keeping myself accountable means actually understanding that I have a responsibility to create a more equal world, right? Like a place where people can enter the room and actually have conversations and know that they will be respected. And even if I don't feel a particular kind of oppression, that I'm responsible for addressing it. For me, for example, being here in Oregon and having come here 7 years ago, I'm not really from Oregon, thinking about how, as I became a professor at University of Oregon, I have to acknowledge that I'm living in native land. You know, I'm really happy that that's something that we have talked about this morning because it tends to be ignored in most of my classes, right? In most of the discussions I enter in this town. That I, as a woman of color, I'm a woman of color, but I'm not a native Oregonian, and this is native land. How do I honor that, right? How do I create spaces where people have those conversations? How do I learn more about that history that was completely something that I didn't know about before? That's what I mean about keeping myself accountable and creating something new, creating new conversations, new spaces, and honoring people too on their experience. And lastly, evaluate, right? We have to assess what we do. Is what I'm doing working? Is it actually creating a more inclusive space in my community? Am I excluding people still? Why? How? How's that not really working? If I send a letter to a TV station, if I send a letter to a newspaper, what were the effects? What were the consequences of that? What could I do next time? That's what I mean by evaluating. And I present these principles to you not in order. I don't think these things happen necessarily in order, though I do feel that first we have to pay attention to people and respect them to do the rest. But all these things happen simultaneously as we try to do this work of creating different kinds of communities. Now, I want to share with you a story, a little bit of how I have applied this to my classroom. And as Carmen said before, I'm actually a professor of ethnic studies at University of Oregon. And that, people have different ideas of what that means. That is not about culture or folklore. What I do is actually I teach about racism. Every day in my classes, I talk directly about racism and colonialism. So as you can imagine, that can be a little hard. I have students, sometimes I have 150 students in my class that have never heard anything about what racism is or what colonialism is in their history. So there's a lot of fear and anxiety in that space. And so students come, and sometimes they have a really hard time sharing ideas, even asking questions. So part of what I do is think about how can I create a community where people can actually talk and share ideas and ask those really difficult questions without being so terrified by that. Well, recently, my students know that I like to be creative, and I do all kinds of things in my classroom. I play games, I do a lot of things in my class. But they told me, well, Professor, you've been talking so much about decolonial ways of teaching, about ways of teaching that don't follow the usual lecture format where it's a banking system, and you're just memorizing what I tell you, just take a little exam, or that it's really impersonal. Students become numbers, right? Where we don't really have a space to talk about the feelings that we bring into the classroom. And I had talked to them a little bit about Afro-Caribbean traditions. I'm from the Caribbean, and I'm actually somebody who works in recuperating Black traditions in the Caribbean. And part of what we believe is that our ancestors, those who came before us, are always here with us, right? That as I stand here with you, I'm not speaking just for myself. I'm actually surrounded by all those people who struggle and lived before me and who were happy before me. And that my obstacles and also the things that I'm able to do well have to do with the fact that they were here before me. So I said, well, if you're willing to go there, I'll go there, Are you really willing to do this? And they're like, yes, we're willing to do this. So I created this exercise that I called, Who Are My People? And I want to invite you today to take a moment and think through these questions that I'm going to pose for you. Think them through, write them down, take them home with you. Because it was a really deep meditation about what it means to build community. So in that classroom, I had around 20 students, so it was quite a small place. And I told them that the first thing I wanted them to do was to think about and maybe do a drawing or a poem where they talked about what do you feel in your body when I say, let's talk about racism, let's talk about racial difference. What do you feel? Like, do you feel tense, anxious, really excited and joyful? Or does it make you nervous? How do you even feel like tense in your shoulders? What do you feel? And the idea behind that is to really honor the fact that you bring these feelings to the classroom, right? And that when you respond to other people, you're coming from that place. So you need to really be aware of where you're at, right? Instead of just looking at other people, look at yourself first. Where am I at with this conversation? and how can I contribute to it? Then the other thing we did then is I moved them from that place to then visualizing. And I invite you to visualize this too if you can here. Who do you imagine to be your people? When you think of your people, who comes to your mind, right? Who are the people you think, oh yeah, those are my people, that's my community. I count on them. They count on me. They taught me some values. If I do something wrong, they're the ones who are going to say, hey, you did something wrong. Who are these people? And then start looking at them very closely in your mind. Or bringing them into the room with you if you want, right? So that they're sitting next to you. And evaluate a little bit. Is this a diverse group of people? Can you say that if you think of race, religion, socioeconomic status, language use, is this a group of people that you would say, well, it's quite a diverse group of people? Or is it quite homogeneous? Is it kind of, everybody kind of lives in the same place, does kind of the same things, lives, talks the same ways? Is it homogeneous or diverse? Why? Why is that the case? What has produced this community around you? And I'll be really honest with you. When I did this exercise, I didn't think it would go this deep, where it went. So it was really surprised me as a teacher. But my students opened up so beautifully. Suddenly I had them all go around in a circle, and they had to, if they wanted to, they could share what came to them through their reflection. But they had to just listen and not interrupt each other. They just had to listen to each other and sit with what they were listening. And people share histories of migration, of economic hardship, of really hard work to get to college, but also stories of joy, of beautiful communities that sustain them too. But the two things that they share that I wanted to share with you today that I feel like really crucial, especially when we talked about diverse communities in university campuses, is how is it that, for example, my students who identified as white, who said, I identify as white, and who said that their communities were mostly homogeneous, white, middle-class communities, they shared with us what they feel when I say, let's talk about racism, right? They said, I feel afraid sometimes because nobody in my house has ever talked about this before. Or I get really angry because I'm reading all these things and I realize that people lied to me my whole life. I've never learned that actually there's racial inequalities in my society and that they were happening right next to me and I was oblivious to it. Other people just get angry. They're like, I'm angry at this and I'm angry at you because you're forcing me to look at this and I don't want to see it. It's just, I had a student once tell me, I've never heard something good about people of color. All I hear at home are really bad things about people of color. And this is the first time I'm reading things by people of color and I'm liking it. I don't know, that doesn't fit in my head. And that's really upsetting for me. And other people were just like, I'm just really anxious. I don't want to offend anybody, right? So those were some of the things that those students brought to the classroom. Then the other, some of my students of color and Native students, were sharing their own experience, what that looked like for them. And they were saying, actually, for me, the university, for the most part, is not really my community. It tends to be quite a hostile place. When I go into the classroom and professors say, let's talk about racism, I'm bracing myself because I know what happens sometimes in those conversations. My classmates start saying, racism doesn't exist. We got rid of that back in the 1970s. Or Latinos are lazy and people of color only come here because of affirmative action. They're not smart enough to be in the classroom with me. It's true, these are the things that happen, right? So these students actually are talking about how then when I ask them to have the conversation, they're either quiet sometimes because they're just waiting to see what's gonna happen, what's gonna go down, and how they're going to protect themselves or defend themselves, right? Or they're going to choose to then try to just go through the quarter as quietly as possible so that their academic performance is not affected by some discussion in class that really affects them or that affects how people perceive them in the classroom. So it was really incredible because basically I had been with the students for 6 weeks, right, of the quarter. I had only 4 left. And I had been having a really hard time getting them to talk, to be honest about the readings that we're doing, the topics that we're talking about. And for the first time, they were actually at least telling me why, right? Like, what is it that we're not engaging in these really open conversations that we need to have to get the homework done, actually, to just get their homework done in the first place. But the beautiful thing is that they transform themselves, right? After this conversation, suddenly they began to do the readings more, they began to write their papers, they began to have really hard conversations in class, and actually began to keep each other accountable. So they began to say, you know what you just said, that is not really, that is actually a stereotype about, let's say, Asian American communities. And they would just say that, right? It would be like respectful, but we're just trying to learn here from each other. And this is not easy, right? It was hard. It's not easy to hear these things. But they were able to imagine themselves as a community committed to the same goal, right? At some point in that conversation, they told me, Professor, when we were evaluating, we feel like a community. We have all these differences. We have different experiences of this issue, but we're committed to creating a new world, a different world. And we understand now that if we don't have these conversations, that's never going to happen. So let's do it now. There's just 20 of us here. When we go out there in the world, it's just going to be me, maybe in my office. So at least here I have 19 people who want to have the conversation. And I think that what was really great about that is that they became better students. I became a better teacher. And also they were able to also understand that the conversation didn't take place on an equal place, right? Like students, they understood that for students of color, the price was higher in that conversation. That if it went in a bad way, actually who was going to feel it in their bodies mostly was the student of color who every time they go out in the street, that's what they receive, right? Some kind of racist remark or strange gaze, out there. So it was that awareness of the inequality in the classroom that made possible the construction of the community. And to this day, now 6 months later, they still hang out, the students from that class. They hang out, they talk, they create projects together. So I want to share that with you because that's one way in which these 7 principles, just listening, respecting, reflecting, keeping people accountable, that transformation, creating something new, but also evaluating what works and doesn't work, allows us to create new kinds of communities. And that has worked for me as I do migrant rights work, as an activist, as an intellectual in the US, in the Caribbean, Latin America. It's not easy, but I really invite you to just take that challenge and see how it works for you, and hopefully come and talk to me to see what I can learn from your experience too. Thanks so much for listening.